Hi, everybody. Captain Lou here. Welcome to another edition of Captain Lou's Championship Years in Sports History. The concept of the show, as you may recall from our opening show last week, was we pick out a year each month and we highlight the championship teams that made some glorious runs and became a part of championship history. And for our inaugural month, we chose 1984. And of course, last week we talked about the 1984 Detroit Tigers. 40 years ago was their magical run to the World Series. A great show. If you want to check that out, make sure you check it out on our YouTube pages on 12 Ounce Sports and, of course, the Captain Lou Sports Network on YouTube. And this week, we thought we would take a look back at 1984 with the magical run of the Edmonton Oilers, the start of their dynasty. It was their second straight trip to the Stanley Cup Finals. Of course, in 83, they lost to the New York Islanders, and they had no intentions of doing the same thing as they made their way to the to the Stanley Cup Finals. And we thought, hey, let's bring in someone who was there front and center, and that was Steve Lansky, longtime producer of Edmonton Oilers Productions pre- and post-game shows. He was there. He got to see pretty much all of that run in 1984, and we've got some great stories to hear from Steve Lansky. So we will check that out. So again, you're watching the Captain Lou's Championship Years in Sports History. We highlight the Edmonton Oilers of 1984, and we'll get you that conversation with Steve Lansky right after this from one of our sponsors that, of course, is tickets.12ouncesports.com. Hi, everybody. Captain Lou here from 12 Ounce Sports and the Captain Lou Extravaganza. If you're like me, you like to go to ball games in person, don't you? Or a hockey game. And Stanley Cup playoffs are in full swing. Your favorite NBA team in the second round of the playoffs, or maybe all the way to the top. Major League or minor league baseball, nothing like a Saturday night game at a ballpark. Well, your place to go is tickets.12ouncesports.com. Use the promo code 12ounce too, and you'll get a better discount. We are a ticket broker. We won't make you pay those fees that you'll see at some of those secondary markets. Tickets.12ouncesports.com. Can't say enough about it. It's where I go to get my last-minute tickets to go to a ball game on a Saturday night or any night during the week. Tickets.12ouncesports.com. I'm telling you, that is the place to go. Stanley Cup playoffs, NBA playoffs, Major League, minor league baseball, and more. That's tickets.12ouncesports.com. Is our year this month, and we are pleased and excited to be joined by Steve Lansky. He was front and center for the Edmonton Oilers run in 1983 and 84, start of a mini dynasty. Steve, welcome to the program. How are you?
I'm great, Captain Lou. How are you?
I am doing wonderful. Before we get into, hard to believe that 84 season or the Stanley Cup has already been 40 years ago. It just seems like yesterday.
Where is that? Where is that? There we go. 4-0. Unbelievable.
Yeah, that we'll get into this in a minute, Steve, but just the style of hockey back then was incredible with all the output, the goal scoring and whatnot. It's something that I truly miss in the game of hockey.
I would lie if I say I didn't miss it too. There wasn't a ton of defense. The goaltending wasn't great, although there were great goaltenders, and we're going to talk about them today, but it just wasn't the caliber that it is now. And players were just kind of learning to be explosive and break out. I mean, Wayne Gretzky kind of started that. Marcel Dion, Mike Bossy, Brian Trottier, they were kind of at their peak at that time. And man, it was fun to watch, wasn't it?
Well, it sure was. And I show tapes to my son and some of the younger people from the generation that never got to see it live, and they can't believe how explosive it was. You talked about Gretzky. They and the Edmonton Oilers came over from the WHA, and they made their mark in a hurry. And the season before, the 82-83 season, they came into their own, really waltzed through the playoffs right up until the Stanley Cup final, and taking on that New York Islanders team that just, Steve, wasn't ready to give up the crown as the kings of the NHL.
Hey, listen, if you've won 3 in a row, you pretty much want to win 4 in a row.
Yeah.
And, the Oilers got spanked in 82 in the playoffs by the LA Kings when they lost that miracle on Manchester.
Yeah.
It kind of chokes me to even say that. And then they should not have gone out in the first round. And I think they had something to prove in 83. I don't have it in front of me. I think they only lost 1 game before the Stanley Cup final that year.
Yeah.
And they just met the Islanders and they just flat out were not ready. I mean, you're talking about, kids in grade 11 playing against kids in grade 3. Like, they can be great grade 3 players, but they are not going to be great. And the Islanders were in grade 11 or maybe even in university. They schooled the Oilers from top to bottom in that series.
It's funny is I kind of relate it to some of the other teams that achieved greatness in both the NHL, maybe even the NBA a little bit. It's almost like you got to pay your comeuppance or pay your penance. Like, for example, the Red Wings in the 90s and, the Pistons in the late 80s. You got to the championship round, but you didn't know what it was like, and you learned from the masters. And I think Edmonton, in my opinion, really learned a lot of valuable lessons in that 82-83 Stanley Cup final.
Captain Lou, if I say to you something 1,000 times, I explain it to you 1,000 times, or you can do it once, which one are you going to learn more from? You're going to learn from doing it that one time.
Yeah.
So when you get to the finals, there's no way to tell these players what it's like. And you get there and you go, oh, now I get it.
Yeah.
And that, there's that famous story of the Oilers walking by the Islanders' room and the Islanders are all battered and bruised after 83. I don't know whether it's true or not. I don't know whether it's been embellished over the years. But if I saw a bunch of guys beat up after winning the Stanley Cup, I might scratch my head and go, maybe that's a component that we haven't figured out yet.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously they learned from it. And you could tell later on in the year, well, actually with the start that they got, but heading into the 83-84 season, one of the most interesting things for everybody in the league that year, Steve, was the advent of the 5-minute overtime. And, you look at their record, 57-18-5 that year, 119 points, but it was a lot different than what it is now. For the traditionalists back then, a tie was a tie. You played 60 minutes and that was it. Compared to now, I don't mind that 5-minute overtime scenario because you didn't get a point if you lost or even went into the extra session. And that 119 points to me looks a lot better than 119 points does now.
That's a great point. They didn't play a team in the playoffs that year in 84 that finished even close to them in points. The Islanders were the closest, and I think they were maybe 15 points behind. Yeah. But the North Stars and the Flames and the Jets, the Oilers were light years ahead of those guys going into that Stanley Cup playoffs. And they didn't lack any component. That's the thing that I keep looking back to. I know the 84-85 Oilers were voted the best team in Stanley Cup playoff or NHL history. But to me, that 83-84 team missed nothing. There was no component they didn't have.
We could talk about all the accolades that Wayne Gretzky had with, his 200 points again, which I don't know if that's ever going to be topped right now. Just the style of play is different. And I'm not taking anything away from the superstars now with Connor McDavid, Draisaitl, Austin Matthews, whatever. But that was just one of many accolades and standards that were set by Wayne Gretzky. His records are so numerous.
I don't have it in front of me, but I think that's the year he had his 51-game point streak. I'm not positive, but I think it was. Yeah, and I probably saw Wayne play about 600 times in person in his career. That includes some WHA games, tons of road games, because I worked for Hockey Night in Canada for about a decade. So I saw Wayne play all over the place. I have never and will never see a player like Wayne Gretzky as long as I live. And I feel so blessed that I got to see him play that many times. He did stuff that I've never seen before or since. He thought stuff on the ice I've never seen before or since. It was scary, man. It was just, I don't know any other way to say it. It was just scary.
And they scored 446 goals that year. You think about that for a second. You divide that by 82. or 80 back then in the regular season. That's 5 goals a game.
Yeah.
That's just those stats are mind-boggling.
It's to me, when I hear that, I think, how did they ever lose a game? How did they ever?
Exactly.
But you know what? Some teams shut them down every once in a while. I know Wayne's record point streak was stopped by the LA Kings, who had no business stopping it, but they did. But the Oilers would have games, and I mean, I produced a bunch of games, and I was at games. They'd win 9-2, 8-1. They won a playoff game in 1987. 13-2, I think it was. Like, so when you're racking up those goals, I'll be honest, I don't know how opponents went in there and thought, we just want to get out alive. But some teams would go in and do it.
You know, and you look at the season that they had, you know, obviously they took the lesson that we talked about a few minutes ago, Steve, about losing in the Stanley Cup final. They started off, they rattled off 7 straight wins. And boy, they didn't look back. I think, what did they win? 39 out of their first 53 games or something. Is incredible.
That sounds about right. I'll buy that. You just never thought they were going to lose. I just remember thinking, they're never going to lose this game or that game or whichever game they're playing in. They always seem to have so many ways to win. Let's say Wayne wasn't going. Well, Jari Kurri is going, or Glenn Anderson was going. Mark Messier was going. Willie Lindstrom was going. And I haven't even said Paul Coffey yet, who I think he's the best offensive defenseman and the most beautiful skater I have ever seen in my life. And that's just a few components we're throwing out there.
You know, it's funny is I was blessed to be able to watch Nicholas Lindstrom here in Detroit all those years. And I have to say, no, obviously I didn't see Bobby Orr. That was a little before my time. But I got to tell you, I'm right there with you. Paul Coffey in his prime, I don't think there's anybody better. Just the way he handled himself on the ice was something else.
So smooth.
Yeah.
And not only that, you got to remember when he started, oh man, people were all over him. Lots of mistakes, not getting his assignments, giving, terrible plus minus. And Glenn Sather stuck with him. I'm amazed we haven't talked about Glenn Sather till now. Glenn Sather stuck with him and said, look, Koff. And they didn't get along great, as you know, and he ended up getting traded to Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
But Glenn said, look, Koff, you just do the offensive thing and we'll figure out a way. We'll put Charlie Huddy with you. We'll figure out ways for this to succeed. And man, when he let him off the string, look out.
40 goals, 86 assists that year for a defenseman. That's insane.
It's unbelievable. And what was amazing to me when I think about it is you'd watch a play develop and you'd think, oh, who's going to score on this play? And then all of a sudden the puck went to Paul Coffey, wherever he was coming from, and he would just appear and boom, in the net. It was uncanny, that guy.
Oh, and I look up and down the roster, and I've been looking at this, and one name that stood out to me, he's a retired policeman here in the Michigan area, was Pat Hughes. He had 27 goals, and I mean, you don't think of a guy like that. I mean, a guy like that right now would be making $6-7 million a year.
I don't know if that was the year, but one year Pat Hughes had a 5-goal game in Calgary. and I think it was the year before because he had it in the Stampede Corral, and 83-84 was the Flames' first year in the Saddle Dome. But Pat Hughes had 5 goals in one game, and see if you can guess who he was playing with that game. Wayne Gretzky could set up you and me for a hat trick on any night he chose. And I can't skate. I don't know about you, but it just anybody could do it. But I think if you're Pat Hughes, it would kind of become infectious. These guys are all doing this. I want to be part of the fun. And you know what? He did it too.
I got to ask you, and I'm sure I'll have to ask you this at the end of the broadcast. When you're watching greatness like this, did you ever just kind of take a step back and just think, wow, I mean, you know what I mean? It's just like you don't want to take it for granted how good this team was, how deep and everything.
So when I was producing an Oilers game on Hockey Night in Canada or on ITV in Edmonton, we really didn't have the luxury to soak it all in. Okay. Sometimes there'd be a great play and I'd give it a wow before. Let's cue that up on blue. Let's send it all the way back to the Oilers zone so we can see that 6-way passing play all the way into the net. When I wasn't working and I was just sitting in the press box and watching a game, that's when you really appreciated just how stupid talented these guys were. But when you're working, you kind of have to separate it, and you can't really enjoy it as much as you can. And then you watch the highlights later and you go, hey, we did a pretty good job televising that Picasso that the Oilers just painted.
I love that. That's a great word for it, for the whole season of Picasso. Steve Lansky's joining us here on Captain Lou's Championship Years in Sports History, highlighting 1984 this month, and of course to look at one of the most dominant teams in NHL history, that being the Edmonton Oilers. The season it's kind of a strange season, Steve. They had some big winning streaks, but they also had some crazy losing streaks too. Now, I understand the one they had where both Gretzky and Curry were injured, and they won the first game. I think it was, if I can look it up real quick here. I was going to try to do it on memory. They won against Calgary, but then they lost 5 in a row, including an 11-0 loss to the Hartford Whalers. Who could imagine a team that good would drop an 11-0 game to the Hartford Whalers?
It's funny, that game wasn't on TV. Back in the day, not every game was on TV. Maybe 40. If you lived in Edmonton, maybe you could watch 40 games.
Okay.
The rest of the games you couldn't. That game was not on TV. And that was one of the biggest stink jobs of all time. That, in fact, it might be the worst that the Oilers have ever tossed. And sometimes you just need it to get your head back where it belongs. And the beauty of that was they'd been to the Stanley Cup final in 1983. And I don't want to diminish the regular season, but once you've been there, you realize that those 80 or 82 or 84 regular season games, they mean something, but not everything. And I think Glenn Sather and Teddy Green and John Muckler, the 3 coaches that year, were great at saying, hey, guys, just take that, crumple it up. We'll throw that over there. Because you know what? In April, it ain't going to matter. And it did not.
You mentioned Glenn Sather, and we have only talked about him a couple of times, but, what a mastermind. And I'll say this because he had such talent. It's like any other sport. You only have so many pucks on the ice, and keeping all of those those freewheeling, high-scoring guys happy. And I know winning cures a lot of evil, Steve, but boy, oh boy, he did a good job of massaging a lot of egos and really keeping that dynasty going past 84, for that matter.
So I met Glenn Sather when I was in high school, and he became our neighbor on our street. And I ended up being the first statistician for the Edmonton Oilers when they went into the NHL. Glenn and I knew each other really well. We played pickup basketball in my driveway. We'd go over to the neighbors. Glenn needed his truck washed, so we'd play a little 2-on-2 versus the neighbors. We won every time because it's Glenn Sather and he ain't going to lose. Glenn got his Ford Bronco nice and clean all the time. I have never met anybody like Glenn Sather who could understand people's personalities and what people needed and didn't need, and whether they needed massaging, whether they needed to be left alone, whether they needed their tires pumped, whether they needed a little, slam dunk every once in a while. Glenn understood that like nobody I've met before or since. He understood personalities and people. Good coach, but unbelievable with personalities and people.
I look at this one stretch that they had where they won 13 out of 14 games. It was right, I want to say right like from the 35th game to the 50th game or something around there. And in that time, you talked about how maybe the goaltending wasn't the greatest back then, but what a mixture of games. I look at this like a 2-0 shutout they had. Then they played the North Stars one night, won 12-8. That must have been one heck of a game to produce there, Steve. 20 goals.
I didn't do the 12-8 game. I'm pretty sure Paul Coffey got 8 points in that game. I'm not positive, but that's what I remember. But the thing about them was they kind of realized they could win any way they had to win. If they were only going to get 2 goals, Grant Fuhr and Andy Moog, who were arguably the best tandem in the history of the National Hockey League. I'm sure there were better tandems if I really sat down and crunched my brain. But if you said to me, best tandem, I'm taking them right off the top. Because if it wasn't Fuhrer, it was Moger. If it wasn't Moog, it was Fierzy. They could Glenn could interchange them any way he wanted. So we're talking about Coffey and Curry and Lindstrom and Gretzky and Messier and Anderson. How about Fuhrer and Moog? Like, there was no weak link.
And they were young. They were what, 25 and 24 or 23?
I think Grant Fuhrer was 22 the year they won the Stanley Cup.
Isn't that something? I mean, I'm probably getting the years mixed up. In the Stanley Cup final, he got injured and Andy Moog took his place. Is that correct?
Yeah, in 1984, that's right.
It was. Okay.
Yeah, so Fierzy, didn't do a great job against LA in 82. Yeah. 83, they go all the way to the Stanley Cup final. Andy Moog's the guy. But then in 84, Slats has who can do this? Slats gets to come back with Grant Fuhrer, and Grant Fuhrer goes all the way. He got hurt in the Minnesota series. He missed one game, and then he got plowed into the boards by Pat Hughes, who we talked about, and Pat LaFontaine. Yeah. And Fuhrer got hurt, and then he didn't finish that Stanley Cup final. Moog was in net.
And it's funny is I remember watching that, and I remember seeing that happen. And I thought, boy, and I just wondered to myself if that was going to make a difference in that. Well, we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Obviously, it didn't. But you talk about it, the depth in those two goalies. And, with Andy Moog, I was jealous as a Red Wings fan, especially, in 84. It was like 2 years prior, Detroit would have to give away a car just to get people into Joe Louis Arena to watch a hockey game. It's so different how it was back then.
It was very different, and Glenn had just everything at his disposal. But like you said, you can have the whole chessboard with all the pieces. You still got to know where to move the pieces to win the game. And nobody did that like Glenn.
So how did he keep the focus, though? It's funny. It's on our last show, we talked about the Detroit Tigers that year. They started out 35-5. And I asked him, I said, how did Sparky keep the focus with the guys? It's so easy to take the foot off the gas. How was Glenn able to keep them motivated to keep such a big lead towards the end of the regular season?
Well, when you talk about Sparky Anderson with the Reds and the Tigers, you're talking about literally one of the greatest managers of all time. For me, he's right there with Earl Weaver and Billy Martin. Mm-hmm. Glenn was very smart. Glenn basically said to the guys, look, do whatever you want. Don't embarrass the team. And I'm talking about on and off the ice. You go wild offensively, because Glenn did some stuff in the WHA. And he saw Bobby Holland, he saw Anders Hedberg, and he saw Ulf Nilsson, and he saw Kent Nilsson with the Winnipeg Jets. And he watched how they were just allowed to go crazy offensively and make up for a lot of defensive issues that those Jets might have had. Well, I was at enough Oilers practice to watch. He just basically threw pucks out there and said, guys, I just want you to skate your brains out. Have fun. Practice would end. Slats would go back into the room. Gretzky'd be out there. Messier'd be out there. There's that much snow on the ice, and they're still practicing until they finally say, okay, guys, we gotta end this. But the beauty of it is, we haven't talked about this. Those Oilers grew up together, and there is no substitute for that. Am I right? You're in school, let's say. These guys that you form bonds with in school, sometimes you're friends with them for the rest of your life. Well, this was basically school. That the other, because it's 22, 21, 23, 24 years old. They're just growing up. They're just going into the league. And Glenn said, hey, guys, we're a team. And he didn't use the word family, but we're going to grow together. Made all the difference in the world, in my opinion.
Was there a player or two, Steve, that you were surprised that was as good as they were on that team that year? Does that make sense?
It does. Willie Lindstrom did a good job. Willie was a little bit older. He played in the WHA with the Winnipeg Jets, and the Oilers brought him in. He scored a few points in the Stanley Cup playoffs that I thought, I didn't see Lindstrom doing that. They brought in Yaroslav Pozar, an older Czech player, and he played a bunch of games. But I think all of it, Captain Lou, factors into the components of Glenn knew where to put this guy here or this guy here. Or this guy would slide in for a game. Pat Conacher played a couple of games, got a key goal in the Stanley Cup final.
Yeah,
Who knows? Who knows how? Yeah, right. Who knows how to slot all those guys? So they all surprised me, but they were only given the chance to surprise because Glenn knew which piece to put in which part of the puzzle.
You know, you had Kenny Linsman, 18 goals that year too. I mean, there's somebody we haven't mentioned. It. We could talk for 2 hours just on all the different guys we haven't mentioned that had, 60 points or 50 points on that team. It's just mind-boggling.
And think about it. Who thinks Kenny Linsman is going to be a good fit there? Except here's Glenn. 1980 double overtime.
Yeah.
Oilers lose to the Flyers in 3 games. But he hated Kenny Linsman's guts so much that only means one thing, doesn't it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
We need him. And he brings him in, and Linsman scored the Stanley Cup winning goal for the Oilers that year. I wouldn't have said he fit in that dynamic. But Glenn knew exactly what to say to him. You're going to do this, but you're not going to do these things. You're not going to take stupid penalties. You're just going to go out there and basically piss people off for 60 minutes. Perfection.
Boy. Okay, now we get to the playoffs, and they dispatched of Winnipeg rather easily, 9-2. I know the second game, I think, was an overtime game. Then the third game, 4-1, back when it was, I think, 3 out of 5. And then Calgary. We all know the rivalry that Edmonton has with Calgary. And that went 7. Were you surprised that it went 7 games?
That's a good question. I was at every game in that series. Before that series, a couple of Oilers said they didn't really think there was that big a rivalry between the teams. Now, to me, if I was Calgary, that would have ticked me off.
Oh, sure.
But Badger Bob Johnson only wanted to do one thing. He wanted to win the Stanley Cup.
Yeah.
But honest to God, I think that was 1B. He wanted his Flames to beat the Oilers so bad. And when that series started, the Flames came out and really, they wanted to win, but they really wanted to hit the Oilers. They wanted to make the Oilers pay for every inch of ice that they got. So the Oilers went up 3-1 in that series. Flames came back and made it 3-3.
Yeah.
Kerry Wilson, rookie, scored an overtime goal for the Flames in Game 2. And I'll be honest, the Oilers changed goalies in Game 7. And they still won the series, but that series was as close as it was going to get. And Paul Coffey after said, they scared the crap out of us. And maybe that's what the Oilers needed.
That could have been how was the atmosphere for that Game 7 in Edmonton? That had to have been something.
The atmosphere was nuts for every game. Absolutely every game. And Game 6 was the game that went to overtime.
Yeah.
And Lanny McDonald scored that goal that I still think Fuhr should have had from the left side half boards.
Yeah.
But I just remember the place going nuts. And it was just so intense. Now, it was less intense than 1986. That was the series that, I can't believe I'm going to say it, Steve Smith scored in his own net.
Oh,
but yeah, that series was the greatest series I've ever seen in my entire life. Again, I was at every game. That was nuts. But 84 was the year the Flames figured out, and if they'd have had goaltending, they had Reggie Lemelin and Don Edwards, who weren't great. In 86, they had Mike Vernon, who was going to win a Conn Smythe Trophy for your Red Wings.
Yep.
Yeah. In 86, they beat the Oilers. But in 84, man, if they'd have had a couple of breaks, they'd have beaten them. And I think they scared the Oilers, and the Oilers knew it.
Oh, definitely. And anybody that says it didn't, I think, they might be telling a little bit of a lie. So for those that don't know, the way the format was back then was the top 4 teams in each division played each other in the opening 2 rounds of the playoffs. And Steve, I can say this now, but I look, we being Norris division fans here in Michigan with the Red Wings and back then the Maple Leafs and the North Stars and the Blackhawks, it was like the minor leagues. It was like the IHL at the time playing the NHL. You could tell. And then when you guys took on the North Stars, it was like men playing against boys.
It's too bad. But, and I don't want to say Minnesota had no chance, but they had no chance. They had 88 points. The Oilers had 119. And I think what you said, Captain Lou, makes sense. You built your team to win your division. So the Oilers, they wanted to just beat Calgary and Winnipeg. And then whoever they played in the Norris in the Campbell Conference Championship Series, that was okay. But the Jets tried to beat the Oilers. The Flames tried to beat the Oilers. The Oilers tried to beat everybody in the Smythe. The Norris was more of a muckers division, right?
Oh.
You had the Blues in there too. You know, you had Broby, you had, Joey Kocur. Like, it was a tough division. But when Minnesota came to play Edmonton, they just did not have the horses that could get it done. There was just no other way to.
Yeah, and I know we're not talking about 88, but I can remember, distinctly remember when Detroit won the first 2 rounds of the playoffs. And then I think they actually surprised the Oilers in game 1 of the conference finals. And then it was like, all right, boys, this is enough. And they just pummeled Detroit in 4 straight. That's all. It still wasn't any better, I think, 4 years later.
I felt bad for Jacques Demers because I like Jacques Demers. I'm really glad he won a Stanley Cup in Montreal in '93. And he was trying so hard. He had Peter Klima. He had, everybody, Yzerman trying to score. And it's just like, geez, man, you just don't have enough. Yeah. And I know Greg Stephan was great and Sam Saint Laurent did his very best. But the goaltending wasn't there either. But other than that, Detroit was really close.
Yeah, they were, but getting back to 84, we talked about it. They won, the first 3 games. Well, they won a couple of close games, but they put up 7 goals, 8 goals, 4 goals. And then the clincher to get to the cup was a 3-1 win. And it was at Minnesota, I believe. And so now you go to the Stanley Cup finals. And again, it's the Islanders. And boy, I can imagine they wouldn't probably say this publicly, Steve, but I bet you that's who they really, really wanted. They wanted that revenge so bad.
Guaranteed. And at that point, you would think, if you were the Oilers, we've figured this out. We can give the Islanders something we've never been able to give them before. Think about this. Going into that series, the Oilers had only ever won 1 game in Nassau Coliseum. It was in the 1981 Stanley Cup playoffs, Game 5. They were actually going to lose that series to the Islanders, but they won Game 5. It was a throwaway game. Other than that, they never won in Nassau Coliseum. Never won. But I think you're right. I think they wanted the Islanders, and I think what really helped was different than 83. The Oilers started on the road. Okay. And I think that made a huge difference. Now, we all know what happened in the first game. I'm sure we're going to talk about it in a minute. But I think not playing that game in Edmonton really, really helped the Oilers, because starting at home, you're thinking. Nobody wants to think. You just want to do. I think on Long Island, they were just able to do what they needed to do.
And then we talked about this. We talked about how you could plug different players in and everything. Just think of how much money, if you were a gambler, you could have made if you would have picked Kevin McClellan to score the only goal in that game and win 1-0.
It was amazing. But I think during that game, and let's face it, to this point in the playoffs, Grant Fuhr has been talked about by every Oilers skater as being the difference in the series, whatever series it was. The Calgary series, the Winnipeg series, they talked about Fuhr all the time. So in that game, I don't think anybody's thinking he's going to toss a 1-0 shutout. But this is the point where you realize, oh, the Oilers are a different team. They can do different things. They don't have to win 6-2. And then McClellan gets the puck. And I mean, he's so bad a skater, the puck goes in the net and it looks like he's just running on his skates because he's so excited. And the Islanders had to be, what the hell is this? Why can't we win this game? But they weren't going to beat Grant Fuhr that night. I'm sure if they were playing now, they still wouldn't have scored.
Nah, boy, that was one heck of a game. And then, of course, Game 2, they get the best of them, 6-1. Then you talked about it. It shifts back to Edmonton. And the Islanders are actually leading, I think, 2-1 in the second period. Then Mark Messier started it all for him and, got the Oilers the lead back in the series.
I think that was kind of the moment, if you want, that the Messier legend that still lives today in, oh my God, 2024. How can that legend be 40 years old? And how can you have been a legend for 40 years? But that's when the legend kind of started. He just kind of took the game in his hands. Was that the game he scored going down the left side, or was that the game he scored going around Gordon Dineen?
I want to say
I can't remember.
I can't.
I'll buy that. Anyway,
Okay.
he scored 2 goals in 2 games,
Yeah.
in 3 and 4, and he just bulled his way in and just dominated and showed what he could do on those 2 plays. But those 2 plays set him apart and basically said to the Islanders, "Oh, just so you know, we also have this guy." And I think if I'm Dennis Potvin or Stefan Persson or Dave Langevin looking over, I'm going, "Uh-oh, I think we got a problem."
And so in game 4, and here's another one. If you would have told me it was going to take 4 games for Wayne Gretzky to score in the Stanley Cup Finals, I'd have said you're crazy. And he didn't get his first goal until game 4.
But that might be the beauty of it.
Yeah.
I think they'd reached the point, Captain Lou, where we don't need him to score all the time. We just need, we're going to get 20 skaters to do what they need to do. And I'm going to tell you a story. After that series, I'm sitting with Glenn Sather at his house, and we're just shooting the breeze. I think I went over for a coffee. And I said, "Can I ask you a hockey question, Slats?" He said, "Sure." I said, "When did you know you were going to win that series? What moment was it on the ice? Like, when did you know?" And he said, "It wasn't in a game." After game 3, they had a thing, still do, I'm sure, Stanley Cup luncheon, where a couple of players from each team, the coaches go, all the media go, they have this big Stanley Cup luncheon. He said, "I looked at Al Arbor during the Stanley Cup luncheon after game 3, and I knew we were going to win the series." I said, "Come on, you can't." He said, "I'm telling you, that's the moment I knew." So it wasn't even on the ice. And again, we're talking about Glenn and people. He said, "That's the moment I knew." And of course, all he's going to do is go into the room and say, "Boys, I know we're going to win this series. I can see it. I've seen it. Just go out and execute."
You want to know what's weird about that series is an interesting stat that I read, and I never really thought about it till today. They were the first team west of Chicago to win a Stanley Cup since some team from 1925.
Victoria Cougars, maybe?
That might be who it was. Isn't that
I think
funny?
it was the Victoria Cougars. Yes, they were. Yes, west of the Mississippi. That's absolutely correct. It's I guess it just shows when you think back how fast the NHL has exploded in the last 40 years. Because now it wouldn't even be a consideration. But yes, that is absolutely correct.
What was your favorite? I know you had a million of them probably. Your favorite moment of that whole season?
The whole season? I was at game 3 against Minnesota. I was at all the games in that series. And that was the game they won 8-5. The Oilers went up 2-0. Then the North Stars went up 5-2. Then the Oilers won the game 8-5. Gretzky scored on a penalty shot. There were 7 power play goals in the game, which was the Stanley Cup record at the time. It's not anymore. And I'm sitting in the press box during that game. I'm doing stats for the play-by-play guy. It was probably Don Whitman, but I can't remember. And we're in the Met Center in Bloomington. And I don't know if you were ever there, but there was only one deck in Minnesota. So you're at the very top, and it just swoops down to the ice surface. Okay. And the place was bonkers. And I just remember working this game and looking at whoever was doing play-by-play and like, "Are you seeing this?" Like with my eyes. And he looks back at me like, "I can't believe this either." That game, I wish I could have capsulized and crystallized that game, because that game was nuts and beautiful at the very same time.
Yeah, and again, just a great season altogether with a well-deserved Stanley Cup after what happened the year before, and the start of a great run. Well, they already started the run, but not winning the Stanley Cup final, but the start of a great run for that city and for that team. Wow.
And once you win it, then you know exactly what it takes to win it again. And I was the biggest Oilers fan on the planet. And after they won that night, we all went out to a bar and had a few drinks. I do remember cutting people's ties off in the bar with a pair of scissors, and I was completely sober. And the next day we flew back to Calgary, because that's where our office is. Yeah. And my boss, John Shannon, said, "Listen, the Stanley Cup parade is tomorrow. Here's a ticket to fly back to Edmonton and enjoy it."
Wow.
I said, "Really? Thank you." And I flew back and I stood outside City Hall and I watched it all go on. And I thought, man, it does not get any better than this for a fan of a team, right? Championships, it just doesn't get any better. And I can still savor every moment from that season. And it fills, if I think too hard about it, it fills my heart. It's just so exciting and thrilling, all at the same, spine tingling still to this day, 40 years later.
I love it. Absolutely love it. It's starting to make me think of back when the Wings won it back in '97. Right. What was the first NHL game you ever went to?
That's a great question. So I'm a kid. I'm living in Toronto, and I like the Leafs. Yeah. And my aunt was a real hockey fan, my mom's mom, and she had tickets up on the corner at Maple Leaf Gardens. And it's funny you'd ask this. I asked her about 2 weeks ago. I said, "Do you know what the first game I ever went to was, Carol?" And she said, "I don't," but she said it would have been in 1967. I said, "Okay, that's good enough for me." So I saw Phil Esposito, Bobby Orr. I love Jerry Cheevers for the Bruins. So my first game was at Maple Leaf Gardens in 1967. So I don't know how long ago that is, because after a while, you don't want to do math, but I think that's creeping up on 60 years ago. And I remember going to Maple Leaf Gardens vividly and watching these guys. And you know what I remember the most? I went to a game and I thought, there's no announcers. Where are the announcers? Well, of course there's no announcers, dummy. It's a live game. But it never even crossed my mind until I got there, and I'm like, oh, cool.
Oh, wow. That's great. Yeah, it's boy, some fun memories. I'll tell you what. Yeah, the first game, believe it or not, I grew up on the shores of Lake Superior, up by Marquette, about 45 minutes east. So we didn't have the luxury of getting down to Detroit to watch a game at either Olympia or at Joe Louis. I didn't go until I was in college. The first game I went to was at Chicago Stadium back in '89, I think it was. And I thought I was in heaven. That was so much fun.
Well, I don't know how many rinks you've been to games in. I'm at 23, I think.
Wow.
All the other 22 combined are not as good as Chicago Stadium. If it wasn't the coolest rink in the history of the NHL, I don't know what was. They had to walk up the stairs, that organ, and Wayne Messmer singing the anthem. The first time I feel my chest bone start to vibrate. And Don Whitman was doing play-by-play that night, and I was in the booth, and I looked at him like, and John Davidson, remember John Davidson, the NHL?
Oh, boy.
He was an analyst. He looked over at me like, how's that working for you, kid? And I'm like, oh, my God, I can feel that in my chest. I love that building so much.
Now I got chills. You gave me the chills back. That's amazing. What an awesome, awesome memory. I absolutely love it. Steve, this has been an absolute thrill and an absolute treat. I really appreciate you coming on the show and reliving one of the best teams in all of professional sports of all time, the 83-84 Edmonton Oilers. Definitely a dynasty starting that year, and great stories and great memories. This has been fun.
Thanks, Captain Lou. I've really enjoyed it. I'm going to have a smile for about the next 6 days, and this is why.
Right on. Steve, before you go, give me your synopsis on the 2024 Edmonton Oilers.
Oof. I'm really worried about the goaltending. I'm not going to lie. Stuart Skinner scares the bejeepers out of me. But, and we talked about Paul Coffey. Paul Coffey, I believe, has imparted a mindset. Guys, you ain't going to win unless ... And I'm shocked at the player Darnell Nurse has become. And I'm shocked at the team defense I'm seeing. They won a game against the LA Kings, 1-0. That's crazy.
Yeah.
This team shouldn't be doing that either. So if Skinner can do anything, if he can stop any pucks, or if they can stop him from seeing pucks, that's the key. If he sees less than 22 pucks a night, I think they got a chance to go a long, long way.
Oh, I think they do too. It's an exciting brand of hockey. Not quite 1984, but it's an exciting brand of hockey. Steve, again, thanks for taking time out to be with us tonight. It's been an absolute treat. Keep up the great work and enjoy some more Edmonton Oilers hockey.
Thanks, Lou. My pleasure.
All right, there you go. Steve Lansky joining us here, reliving the 1984 Edmonton Oilers season. What a great look back. Some fun stories. It was one heck of a run. like we mentioned at the top, they got to the Stanley Cup final in 82-83, couldn't quite make it, and then get over the hump, if you will. But then there was no doubt about it in 83-84 with that great start they had. And, of course, culminating it with the Stanley Cup win over the New York Islanders. Steve Lansky, again, thank you for joining us. And we want to thank everybody for taking time out to be with us for Season 1, Episode 2 of our brand new podcast, Captain Lou's Championship Years in Sports History. And on our next episode next week, we're going to highlight the 1984 San Francisco 49ers. So that ought to be a great episode as well. All right, everybody, that's going to do it again. Thanks for joining us here on Captain Lou's Championship Years in Sports History, brought to you here, as always, on 12 Ounce Sports and the Captain Lou Sports Network. Buy tickets.12ouncesports.com. If there is a venue or a sporting event that you want to go to, make sure you get the best prices by going through tickets.12ouncesports.com. All right, everybody, until next time, here on Captain Lou's Championship Years in Sports History, Captain Lou telling you to keep your heads up, keep your sticks down, keep your feet moving, and as always, keep your minds open. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Have a great rest of your week and weekend, and we'll talk to you next time. So long.